right, so I'm going to find the clicker. And you know, I know everybody gets excited about talking about governance at 8 a.m. on Thursday morning, so this is exciting. I'm so glad to have you here. So just, I guess I should turn it on. There we go. Just a tiny bit more about me, just so you get a sense of where I am coming from. So after leaving Lutheran Social Services, I thought I was going to retire. COVID hit. I decided to write a book on governance. Nobody was going to read a book on governance, but I decided to write it anyway. And then, for some reason, people started calling me to ask for advice. And so I thought, well, I better have some sort of motto or slogan, and so I created CEO Board Services, changing lives one organization at a time. I actually like that mission statement because that's exactly what all of us are doing here in this room today. And I spend now all of my time teaching cohorts of CEOs, consulting with foundations, nonprofit organizations, schools, congregations, and universities and the like, and writing as well as speaking today. So in fact, the next book coming out, and I've got 4 pages written, so we are well on our way, is and I'm saying this because I would love feedback from all of you on this topic. A Christian Approach to Organizational Leadership in the Age of AI is the working title. And I have no idea what I'm going to say, but I love the title, so we're halfway there. So I mentioned that, so COVID hit, decided to write this book. And what was interesting to me as I was writing this book, and as Steve mentioned, I like to write books. And what I like to do is take a topic that I know something about already, but I know that I don't have it right. So at one point I wrote a book on executive values, another on living a life of significance. I knew I didn't have that right, so I wanted to see what the research said and hopefully help others as well. You know, I've served on 13 different boards of directors. I was CEO. I've seen it from all sides, and I was pretty sure that we didn't have it right. And so I wanted to take a quick look at, or a hard look at the research. And then, but a couple of things happened during the 21, 22, and now current time frame that I didn't actually anticipate. So one thing about this book is, as I was writing it, I was thinking solely about nonprofit organizations. Actually, I wasn't thinking about congregations at all. And in fact, I asked the publisher, should I write a chapter on congregations? And they said, no, we've got this other author, David Peter from the St. Louis Seminary, and he's going to be writing a book on board governance congregations, so you just focus on nonprofit organizations. But what was interesting to me is after the book came out, I started getting calls from congregations saying, this is exactly what we need. This fits us perfectly. And so it was a realization, I think, on my part that there isn't all that much difference between governance models and governance practice, especially in terms of the art of governance, between congregations, nonprofit organizations, foundations, Lutheran schools, Fortune 500 companies, thriving financial. The other thing that I didn't quite realize as I was writing this book is how much our world was going to change post-COVID. And we'll talk about that in a second. But the governance models that worked before COVID, in many ways, while the model might work, the approach has to be different from the leaders and the boards of directors of the various different organizations. And we'll unpack that a little bit too. So the world has changed dramatically in many ways. And I think that's important for us to recognize and name, because what might have worked for you in the past probably isn't going to work as well, if at all, in the future. So this book came out a year or two ago, and 2 years ago, I guess. And what's been interesting to us, we're trying to keep track of this, but we believe that there's probably now over 1,500 organizations that are using this. And so there is a need, we sense, of really trying to unpack and understand how governance, how leadership, how strategic planning, how succession planning can in fact become. So I know we have congregations here, we have nonprofit organizations here, we have schools here, we have foundations here, We have pastors, executive directors, CEOs, principals, etc. Instead of me every time saying, this organization, etc., I'll just use one, but then apply it to your own situation. If I say executive director, it means CEO, it means pastor, because they're all interchangeable in terms of what we're going to be talking about today. So let me see a show of hands, and you may be raising your hands more than once. Who is here today on behalf of a congregation? Okay. Who is here today potentially on behalf of a board of directors? And that would be probably for a congregation as well as nonprofit. Who's here for on behalf of a nonprofit organization? Okay. The foundation, I know we have at least one or two. We have two, I believe. All right. And then, what am I missing? Oh, schools. Lutheran schools. Yes. Yeah. Okay. And after I lay the groundwork, it would be really helpful if you sit together with your group, because we're going to be having some dialogue about your particular congregation or school or organization in between all of this, and then have some roundtable discussion as well. I'll be seeing if anybody wants to provide their input based on what we've talked about or what you've talked about at your tables. So start thinking about that. Who is here completely by themselves as opposed to with any group? Is there anybody like that? Yeah, okay. Well, talk to yourself. Okay, yeah. The good news is, you're going to have all the right answers, right? Yeah. And I see we have a member of the LCMS Board of Directors with us today, so I've got to not tell any LCMS Board of Directors jokes now. So, and if I do, Joe, will you make sure that you don't share them with anybody? Okay, good. So we were privileged to overlap just a little bit on the LCMS Board of Directors, and thank you for your leadership on that. Yeah, it's good to. So why are we here today? This is my hope, is that all of us are here today because whatever organization we're connected to, we want to take it from here to here. As we'll talk about in a little bit, for a lot of different reasons, COVID and now 2025 and some of the things that have happened in the last 9 months, some of us have gotten frozen. So it could be because of succession planning. It could be, there's an interim that we're just kind of waiting. It could be there's funding cuts. It could be just we've been exhausted and trying to get past post-COVID, and we have a brand new board of directors. But there's all sorts of reasons why we haven't necessarily looked ahead as much as probably we should from an organizational perspective in order to continue to ensure that your organization continues to be a missional advantage, but also thrive not only this year, but 5-10 years into the future. So that's why we're here today. And in some ways, this is going to be like speed dating. We're going to go through a lot of different things today, and you're not going to have all the answers after you leave your table today. But the goal of today is to have you start thinking about, hey, this is actually what we're doing good. This is what we really need to work on. This is where we need to focus strategically. And here's a couple of pieces that we're missing, and so let's tee them up at the next board meeting. Let's tee them up at the next leadership team meeting. And so that is the goal for today. This will also be interactive, as I mentioned, but please feel free to interrupt if you have a question. I know we want to get Pastor Tom the steps in. He's going to be passing a microphone around, so we'll make sure everybody has a microphone. I made one mistake yesterday, and Danny is going to love me forever on this, Pastor Danny. So I met Pastor Danny for the first time, and I told him that I had dinner with his father last night. And so, Pastor Tom, I apologize again, but after I share it publicly with everybody. So somehow he's going to get me back. I'm not sure how. So what has changed since COVID? And there's actually 2 slides on this, and this is just a little bit of a representative list. But if you think about this as it applies to your particular congregation, before COVID, when I talk about the old days, I'm actually now talking about 2019. I'm not talking about 2000 or 1980 or 1990. We're talking 2008-19. So fundraising went from 80%, 20% of your donors give 80% of the donations to somewhere between 95 and 5 now and 90 and 10. And so the middle class is feeling increasingly squeezed when it comes to donations, but there's also at the top end a very much a generation of wealth that is starting to begin to be just more generous with their giving. And that obviously has implications in terms of fundraising, right? The story I like to tell is my 96-year-old father will still read every single letter you send him in fundraising, and he'll probably write that $25 or $50 check. I'll throw everything in the mail before I even open it because I know exactly who I'm going to give our donations to. And my daughter doesn't even go to the mailbox because there's nothing in the mailbox that's worthwhile or useful to her, right? That has implications in terms of how we historically have fundraised. Let me see a show of hands. Are you seeing more difficulty in terms of people being willing to volunteer, whether it's board service or volunteer service? Is that increasingly difficult here or not necessarily? If it is, raise your hands. Okay, yeah. It's interesting. It sometimes depends on the community. So I'm teaching CEO classes in Albuquerque and Santa Fe. In Santa Fe, they have absolutely no problem getting volunteers because it's mostly a retirement community. In Albuquerque, they can't find a volunteer to save their life because it's the younger generations and the working, the families and those who are working for a living that are increasingly stressed with time. And so just have a real difficulty being able to do that. Obviously, we're seeing increased societal polarization, and it has implications at the board level, it has implications at staff level, in congregations. Talked to two pastors this past week. One got criticized because he mentioned Charlie Kirk in his sermon. The other got criticized because he did not mention Charlie Kirk in his sermon. It's a situation today where it's really hard to win sometimes, right? And to do the right thing. We're going to talk about technology and AI a little bit more in the future, but later today. But this has a huge implication, and one, it's made in some ways leadership more difficult. So in the old days, again, 2019, the leader could almost know everything about their school or their organization. Today, it's gotten so complex on so many different levels that it's almost impossible to know everything about your organization. And so you really obviously need to surround yourself by key people, but also it's had an implication in terms of who you would want to recruit on your board of directors, because the CEO really needs that sort of sounding board in order to be able to effectively run an organization. For especially those in schools, but even congregations, and I've seen it in nonprofit organizations as well, security has become a huge concern. We did a survey for Lutheran parents in Las Vegas. It was their number one concern. We did a similar survey in Silicon Valley. It was their number 3 concern. And kind of a little bit of a difference between Las Vegas and Silicon Valley, but it was still up there. And that's something that has changed pretty dramatically since COVID as well. Others, we were talking a little bit yesterday how even with the benefits of school choice here in Indiana, it probably hasn't kept up with inflation. So some increasing financial pressure in that realm as well. Increased competition, whether it's charter schools or other private schools, et cetera. Nonprofit world, we're seeing this a lot of in the few areas of the nonprofit world where the funding streams allow you to run profitable programs. So in order to cover overhead and maybe a little bit more, the for-profits are getting into it really in a strong way. And it's been much more difficult for nonprofits to be able to compete. We're seeing a lack of qualified workforce, whether it's nonprofits or schools, even the lack of ability to recruit LCMS teachers because there just aren't enough of them anymore. All sorts of mental health concerns, whether you're talking about students or your parishioners or leaders, that have come to the forefront more than we've ever seen in the past. We talked about the complexity of operations, and we also are seeing leadership burnout. So in the quote old days, again 2019, we would see CEOs be there for 20, 25, even 30 years. Pastors, the same thing. Nowadays, the average tenure of a CEO of a nonprofit organization is 5 to 7. The average tenure of a private university president is 5. And so that has implications from a governance perspective, has implications from in terms of long-term organization, and also as a board member, what can you do to help prevent burnout of your key leadership people so that they do want to stay and they are able to stay. What have I missed, by the way? What else has changed since COVID that in your world? Anybody want to add anything to this list? All right. Yes. Yeah.
Well, a sense of community.
Yeah. Yeah. Joe talked about a sense of community, right? And some of that is as a result of the increased polarization. We don't know how to talk to each other. We don't even understand what each other's perspectives, and we're unwilling to talk to them. And that, and also probably because of social media and our phones and everything, we have less willingness, intention to bring together in community, to get together in community. So I actually do think that is, and so that has a direct impact on congregations, on volunteers, on all sorts of things. Absolutely. So I think the world is increasingly changing at a quicker pace than ever before. And I think we've seen it in spades, and research is pretty clear on this since January 2025. So I'm not up here to be political. I'm not taking sides on anything, whether the decisions are made are good or bad. As Steve mentioned, I can work for all sides in the political spectrum. But what we have noticed, so I think we're working with 40 different nonprofit organizations, and these are solely nonprofit organizations. Since January of 2025, 37 of them have seen funding cuts. That's huge, right? So there's lots of conversations at the board level about, do we dip into project reserves? Do we cut programs? Do we cut staff? Those are really difficult conversations. And as we will talk about, it requires, one, a different skill set of sitting around the board table to make good decisions, but it also requires you to have relationships ahead of time with trust and integrity to be able to have those types of conversations. And that's a little bit different than what we've seen in the past as well. Obviously, AI is a huge deal at this point. You know, there's some efficiencies that I think all of us are experiencing that are just absolutely wonderful. There's lots of conversations going on at the school level of what sort of policies do we put in place, how do we teach children to learn, all of that. There's some cybersecurity issues and some privacy issues that everybody's sorting through. There's also unintended consequences. So working with a food bank in Santa Fe, and they've already had funding cuts from the federal government. And now, because of AI, so historically the grocery stores have given all of their excess groceries that are about to expire to the food banks. Because of AI, they've become so efficient that they don't have any what they call waste anymore. And so the food banks are not getting near what they used to get from the grocery store chains, because the grocery store chains don't have to do that anymore. That's really interesting, right? It's good if you're a grocery store executive. It's horrible, and how do we continue to feed those who are in need going forward? And so they're scrambling to figure out what their organizations look like going forward, because their two main funding streams have all of a sudden been cut dramatically. You know, as we mentioned before, I think societal polarization continues to increase. We're not seeing this get better. Obviously, the tragic Charlie Kirk death just exasperated this, and we're all, you know, trying to figure this out, and hurting and angry and forgiving all at the same time. And so the question then becomes, right, why all this matters. And we're going to talk about why it does. So what's interesting to me is that if I would ask every congregation or organization here to talk about their governance model, to talk about their unique culture, their history, their opportunities, you would all have different answers, right? You might say you have policy-based governance, or you might have a managing governance model, et cetera. But it's your unique culture, it's your unique history, it's the programs you provide, it's what you're looking at in the next 5 years in terms of where you want your organization to be head that will impact how you describe and how you operate a governance model that makes most sense for you. So I'm not here today to tell you what governance model to use. In some ways, that's the least of my worries in terms of your organizations. What I am going to talk to you about is the art of governance, which is, all right, you have this great governance model. How do you then operationalize it so it actually does become a missional advantage? And it matters a lot because what we're finding, and in terms of working with foundations are increasingly realizing this, that an organization or congregation that doesn't have an effective governance model is probably not going to have long-term organizational success. There really is a direct correlation between governance, strategy, succession planning, and long-term missional success. And so that's why it's important to be thinking and talking about the building blocks. I've seen some organizations and congregations, for example, that have absolutely outstanding governance model on paper. They've got the 55-page policy manual. They've got, very clear, but they don't have the trust and integrity, and they don't have the willingness to come together and look forward in the future in the organization. So all of that nice stuff on paper doesn't matter. They probably don't even look at it. And so that's why we're not going to be spending a lot of time with that today. So just a couple of slides on what are the different types of governance models. So this is mostly for congregations, and this comes out of David Peters' book. Now, there's a slide for a picture of that in a second of the cover of jacket of his book. And as an aside, I should have said this earlier, these slides are available if people want them afterwards, so no need to write stuff down if you don't want to. We'll talk to Bruce, we'll talk to Tom, we'll figure out a way to get it to people who want to. So all of this is available if you want it. So a working board is typically found in very small congregations where everybody is a volunteer pretty much, and there's probably one pastor, but the rest are volunteers. And so not only are you on the board of directors, you're probably doing all of the different things to make the congregation run on time as well. We only see that really in very small congregations. Historically, most of the LCMS congregations have gone to what they call, what David Peters calls a managing board. And so what that would be is that you basically have your church council or your board of directors, whatever you decide to call it, and then you have lots of different committees. So you have a committee on worship, you have a committee on education, you have a committee on youth, et cetera, et cetera. And that has in some ways been the primary model for a number of years, and the consultants who do this type of work have been promoting this for a number of years now. What we're finding is that for a number of congregations, this still works well. But for other congregations, it just wears the pastor out because they're expected to go to meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting. And so is there a different way of structuring this? So, I was talking to a pastor in Michigan the other day. He has 11 different committees, and they expect him to go to every committee. There's 2 committees on worship, and they're fighting with each other. and it's a mess. I said, well, you should have probably asked about this before you took the call, but that's a different story. And then the governing board is basically what in the nonprofit world we would call a policy-based governance board. It could be the Carver model, it could be something, but it's really where the senior pastor is typically considered in some ways the chief executive officer. There's a board of directors that has a policy manual that delineates what the board's responsible for, so approving the budget, issuing calls, et cetera, and then what the pastor and his leadership team are responsible for as well. So the idea is that the board of directors and the leadership team under the pastor would set the mission and the vision of the congregation, but really the day-to-day activities would be left to the pastor and his staff. And there may be, for example, a finance committee, or there may be a special committee, but you typically have less committees than you would under a managing model. So for those of you who are with congregations, and there's a little bit of a blending that goes on between all 3 of these, it's not perfect. Who would say in this room you have a working board? Manage, a few, not many. A managing board? And a policy-based board. Okay, so a little bit of both. And the trend has been to go a little bit more policy-based than managing. Some congregations absolutely love it, some are a little bit skeptical, and so those conversations are occurring. There's the book that I mentioned from David Peters. If you're interested in the science of board governance for congregations, it's an outstanding book. CPH published it. So then, if you think about nonprofit models and also school models, foundation models, et cetera, there's all sorts of ways to define them. This is probably how I do it mostly. One is a consultative model. So it's a lot, in some ways, like a working board. And so think Lutheran Women's Missionary League. So Lutheran Women's Missionary League, they're almost all volunteers, right? They have very little staff. And so the board members not only set the strategy and the mission, but they actually do most of the work. Those board members are working 40, 50 hours a week. They're simply an amazing organization. The junior league would have something similar. So a lot of startups in the for-profit world have this, but it's all hands on deck. I'm actually on the board. It's called the ACTS Network, and our mission is to plant LCMS congregations in Central Texas. And we have 5 board members. We have 1 part-time staff. And so it really is, we roll up our sleeves, and we're as volunteers also running the organization. The equal rights model, you probably don't have anything here like that, but you see it in some private universities where everybody has a constituency that they represent. So for example, the faculty gets a vote, the staff gets a vote, students get a vote, alumni get a vote. And the problem with that model is you tend to represent your constituency as opposed to thinking about the university as a whole. So most universities are actually moving away from that into more of what we'll talk about in a second, the shared responsibility model. So the rules of engagement model I find fascinating. So if you have a board that is focused on Robert's Rules of Order, if you have a board that has a 100-page policy manual that dictates everything you want, you can do and you can't do, you're probably under a rules of engagement model. So I'll tell a couple of stories from the old days, nothing current. So when I first began on the board, now 7, 8 years ago with Lutheran Hour Ministries, our policy manual had a lot of different rules that prohibited the board chair from doing anything. And I couldn't quite figure this out, why. And so I asked Kurt Buchholz why. And he says, oh, in the old days, the board didn't like the board chair, so they limited what he could do. They used the policy manual to do that, right? I said, well, hopefully, I'd just become the board chair. I said, well, hopefully you like me now, so can we take a look at that? I'd actually like to do something. And so we changed it, right? Again, in the old days, this is before 2019, before I got on the LCMS board of directors, so not the current administration, but there was dysfunction, I'll say, within the board of directors and within the board of directors in the president's office. And so they used the policy manual to try to control each other. That's an example of that. And Joe, you'll disagree with me on this, but today, so I actually I've read your new policy manual and I think it's really good. So, but today, instead of trying to control each other, what they do is they like to control LCEF, they like to control Concordia Plan Services, and I know you're partners with them, but so it happens when you have like 4 attorneys on that board of directors, is my sense, and as an attorney, I can say that. But no, it's actually a really good policy manual, but it shows that if you looked at 20 years ago, the unhealthiness maybe that had occurred at the board of directors versus today where there is a healthy board of directors, you see it in the policy manual. Yeah. So how many have heard of the Carver model? How many use a pure Carver model at this point? Kind of, right? Or you try, yeah. So the Carver model was I don't even know when, 1990s, 2000 decade. That was the big thing in the nonprofit world. And it was really strict rules in terms of how to implement policy-based governance. So you would put in your policy manual everything in negative language. So the CEO could not do this, the CEO could not do this. So anything you didn't put in negative language, that CEO could do. So the idea was he has a fence in which he can play in, or she can play in, and everything else you have to ask the board for permission for. The problem is you had to really understand it to actually implement it well, and most people did not. The other issue with it is the board was responsible for means, or for ends, and the staff was responsible for means. Nobody knew what that meant. And so what's the ends, what's the means, right? And so where most organizations who have some sort of policy-based governance are going to is what I would call a shared responsibility model, where there is policy in the sense that the staff's responsible for the day-to-day operations, the board's responsible for the oversight of the organization or congregation. And then there's a shared responsibility in putting together a strategy, a strategic plan at the 20, 30,000 feet level. So the board doesn't get into the day-to-day operations, but it does work with the team in terms of setting the vision, setting the mission at that level. And we'll get into this in a second. And then expecting, asking the staff then to, put together operational plans to execute it well. And that's in many ways both the for-profit and the nonprofit world where good governance models are heading to. And all right, so let's switch subjects for a second. I like this quote because one is Peter Drucker, but also John Carver, the other nonprofit guru, one of the nonprofit gurus, talks about how boards tend to be an incompetent group of competent people, right? So we're all competent people, right? But some reason we get together in a group, it's really difficult. And there's a lot of different reasons for that. What the research is increasingly clear, especially since COVID, is that you really need to have there are three attributes of a good, effective, healthy board of directors. One is that you have to have passion for the organization and congregation. And in the old days, that we didn't necessarily always do that. Here's that wealthy individual, let's get their spouse on the board of directors and maybe they'll give us money. That was a nonprofit strategy for a long time. It didn't always work very well because they didn't necessarily come with a passion for your organization. So in order for a board member to give up his or her time and really be an effective board member, they really have to come with a passion for that organization. The second piece is that, again, in the old days, we would tend to get well-meaning, passionate volunteers who just absolutely loved our organization to serve on the board. We didn't necessarily need a lot of different skills and expertise because it wasn't as complicated as it is today. Today, what we're finding is in order for the board of directors to truly be a strategic partner with the pastor or the organizational leader, they need to you need to have a board of directors with the appropriate diversity and skill sets, whatever that means for your congregation or organization. So, if you're a school, you probably want to have parents, you probably want to have someone or a couple people with educational expertise because the education world's changing so dramatically. You probably want to have a finance person, you want to have an attorney, all of those different pieces of the puzzle. You want to have different perspectives, maybe from different communities. You obviously want to have a female-male perspective because we think differently. And so it's important to think about that as well. The third piece that we never really talked about until the last few years, and we're now talking about it all the time in terms of succession planning as well as board membership and leadership hiring, is if that individual doesn't have emotional intelligence, they're probably not going to be an effective board member. And so what happens in a group settings, and there's some research done at the AT&T labs, and now Google's done some as well, is that a group can never be smarter than its individual parts, but one individual can actually bring the entire group down, or two individuals can bring the entire group down. And so, the interesting thing is all of us in this room, and I'm sure we all in this room, have emotional intelligence. But if you look at society in general, you probably, you're looking at about 35% of the population has true emotional intelligence. Now, as Ben and I talked about the other day, you can learn it. Right, and especially if you're taught early and in classrooms, and I think that's important to do. But from a board perspective, what I think is important is to, before you ask someone to serve on your board of directors, see them from different perspectives. Maybe go have lunch with them, go have dinner with them, have a coffee with them, ask other people about them. I was recruiting what I thought was an outstanding board member, and we had an attorney who happened to know this guy, and he said, I just mentioned to him, I said, "Oh, you know him, right?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "Why?" And I said, "I'm thinking about putting him on my board." And he said, I served with him, and he's a great guy one-on-one, but he is a horrible board member because he tries to dominate everything. So it's a lack of emotional intelligence, right? And so understanding who that is before you bring somebody on board, I think, is probably as important as anything. Malcolm Gladwell, The Revenge of the Tipping Point, who some of you probably read, also has an interesting statistic. So, you know, our friends over at the ELCA, they have, in some ways, quotas where you have to have one woman, you have to have one this, you have to have one of that on their board of directors, and that's a mandatory, right? What Malcolm Gladwell would tell you in Revenge of the Tipping Point is the research is clear that, for example, if you take the female representation on the board of directors, you're really not going to get female representation unless you have at least 3. And the reason for that is that if it's just 1 or even 2, they're less likely to really express their viewpoint, and it takes 3 to really have that comfort level to be able to do that. I'm not picking on the women. The same thing if you had 9 women and only 1 man, it'd be the exact same thing. And so thinking about what makes the most sense for your particular organization from a diversity perspective is really important as well. All right, this is the only slide on the science of board governance, because I have seen so many times when the policy manual is perfect, they're following all of this, and it's just a horrible governance situation. So this is something that you can learn on your own. BoardSource has some things, LCMS has some good documentations on this. But basically, the science of board governance means that as a board member, you don't always have to be right. You just have to be reasonable. That's the duty of care. So, you know, showing up at board meetings, making reasonable decisions. Duty of loyalty means you have to put your organization first. So you can't come onto the board as a financial advisor and say, you know, I want to manage all of the endowment assets as part of being on this board of directors. That's not putting the organization first. And the duty of obedience is ensuring that we follow all the laws of the land. In paper, this is all pretty easy, right? You're going to have your audited financial statements. Some of you will be following 990s. You'll be needing all those different things that you'll be checking the boxes. But from a governance perspective, this is just the beginning. So this is what we're going to be talking about. So to me, this is the fun part, because it allows each of us at a board setting to utilize our own unique expertise and our experiences and our talents, our skill sets, our creativity to work together as a team to come up with your organization, your congregation's unique roadmap of what you want to do and what you want to accomplish in the next 5 years. This is the art of governance. You can have science of governance all day long, but if you don't have the pieces of the puzzle of this, you're not going to be successful. And so we'll talk about what those pieces of the puzzle are in order to be successful. And then at the very end of the day, if you stay to the very end, there's actually a 8 bullet point scorecard. So you can actually determine whether or not you are following this. But so there's 2 aspects of this. One is, do you have effective board governance? We'll talk about what that means. And what is that relationship between the leadership and the board of directors? And it's fascinating to me. And so this is one of the things that's happened since COVID. So during COVID, most of us who were on boards spent a lot of time on Zoom calls. We were just trying to survive. We were trying to figure this all out. We went to virtual worship. We went to virtual education, et cetera. And so, but we met by Zoom, right? And then we tended to not meet as much for a little bit when leadership came and went, board members came and went, and we weren't necessarily looking at the future because we were just trying to survive. And so all of a sudden we realized that we really don't have as strong a relationships between board members and between the board and the leadership team than we've had in the past. And that has a huge impact in terms of an organization's ability to wrestle with the difficult issues, make difficult decisions. And especially in this day and age, these are not easy decisions, right? Years ago, I was talking to President Harrison about an issue I had at Lutheran Social Services. And I said, you know, here's my 2 decisions, and both of them are bad. And he gave me the greatest advice. He said, all right, Kurt, this is what you do. You make the best of 2 bad decisions, and you run directly to the cross and you ask for forgiveness. And I thought that was actually pretty good advice, right? And it's an indication that on this side of heaven, we're not going to always have clear-cut decisions. We're not going to always, no matter what we do, it's probably going to have an impact, a negative impact on people. And in order for boards and leadership teams to wrestle with this, there has to be that relationship. And so one of the things that boards and leadership teams are taking a step back to doing these days is figuring out times to have a retreat, to have dinner together, to have breakfast together, to maybe to go out for a drink or whatever works best for your particular congregation. But it's the idea is that in order to make good decisions, you really have to have those relationships first. And so it's something to think about. And we also think, oh yeah, of course, we're all Lutheran, we've got trust, we've got integrity. I've seen it play out in many bad ways. So as an example, in a Lutheran school, not in Indiana, they did not have a great principal. So that principal left. They hired an outstanding principal with a track record of a great historical track record. He had a second board meeting, and so they excused him then and went into executive session. They went in executive session. They said, all right, everything's done. We're done for the day. The board chair then called him up 3 days later and said, I need to have coffee with you. And they had coffee, and the board chair said, well, in executive session, we decided to fire this person, so we need you to go do that. To me, that's a lack of respect. It's a lack of openness. It's a lack of trust. It was unnecessary. In a perfect world, they would have had that conversation together. I don't know if they were right or wrong, but 4 months later, the principal resigned because he says, I don't need this, right? The other interesting thing about boards in terms of post-COVID is boards got really used to being hands-on because they had to be. And now, in some ways, there's maybe a need for them to take a step back and let the leadership team actually do their job. The second standard of excellence is, so if I were to ask you, could you tell me your very focused mission and reason for existing in a 2-story elevator ride? Could you do that? And could it be something that I would actually get excited about, right? The story I like to tell is, again, with the LWML. I've been doing strategic planning with them for a number of years now. And our first one, I actually thought we were going to come in and create all sorts of new programs and do all sorts of exciting things. And we quickly realized that they were overwhelmed. They had too many things on their plate. They were having trouble figuring out what their purpose was in terms of being able to say no to certain things. And so we decided, all right, let's take a step back, and we're going to have this exercise in a few minutes here as well. But what is your reason for existing? What is your purpose? What are we here for? And so we decided everybody would take the night to pray, think about it, write down their purpose, and then we would come back the next morning and everybody would share it with each other. So everybody did that. They're all great lines, but there was one that stood out that absolutely caught everybody's attention. We'll never put it on the website, but the one that stood out was LWML dash, we make it harder to go to hell. I like that. So what that meant, and so then we unpack that, right? What that meant was, all right, they were saying yes to all sorts of things. What that really meant was they were responsible for 2 things that they could then judge yes or no to everything. One was raising money for spreading the gospel for missions for other organizations, right? They're really good at that. That needs to be one of their core foci. The second one was, all right, we're going to also help strengthen the faith of all of the women in the LCMS. So any program that does that, we're going to keep. And programs that fall outside of those 2 categories, we're going to slowly but surely get rid of because we simply don't have the women power in order to do it. It's a great example, right? I'll share one more example because I think this is important because I want you to all start thinking about this as we go through some exercises in a little bit. And that's my old organization. And to my chagrin, we didn't have a great mission statement for probably the first 15 years I worked there. It was provide help, healing, and hope to the children, elderly, and the poor in the name of Jesus Christ. Sounds nice, right? It's good. But the problem with it was we almost had to say yes to everything. When somebody came to us, we had to say yes, whether it was a food pantry or retirement community or children's services. And about 8 years ago, we like to pick on, I like to pick on millennials. So I had a millennial come to my office, and the millennial said, "Kirk, can I talk to you?" I said, "Sure." And I said, "What's up?" And he said, "I don't like our mission statement." And I said, "Why?" And he says, "It doesn't say anything to me." And I said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And he said, "I'm so tired of caring for children who've been abused. I want to break the cycle of child abuse so we don't have to do this anymore." I thought, this is pretty good. And so I shared this with the leadership team. They got excited. We then shared the conversation with our board of directors. They got excited. And we decided, all right, we're going to go all in on this. And so what it did, it allowed us to make some really hard decisions. It allowed us to sell our high-end private pay retirement communities because that wasn't part of our mission. And it allowed us then to get rid of $60 million in debt and create a $40 million endowment to help pay for some of this. It allowed us to create an advocacy program to help change some of the laws in the state of Texas. It allowed us to create research partnerships with Notre Dame and University of Texas and a couple of others to really understand what works and what doesn't work. And what we found, by the way, is that in addition to having social service programs, which we were great at, you also need to have education. You need to have education, you need to have social service organizations. And we also found that when there is generational cycles of abuse, so multi-generational abuse within the same families, it's typically from a very localized community. And so the question then becomes, how do you go deep within that community in order to break that cycle, right? So we got real focused in creating Head Start programs, programs for parents, additional social service programs for children. And it also created an opportunity to have a really difficult discussion of, do we take Lutheran out of our name? And our branding people, we hired some branding people. Our branding people said we are 0 for 3. So we are 0 for 3 in the sense that there's in Texas, I think 2% Lutheran. And so if you really want to invite everybody to join you to break the cycle of child abuse, it served as a little bit of a barrier. The second piece was younger generations think social services is a bureaucracy. And then here in Texas, right, we're not from the South, we're from Texas. So they said we were 0 for 3. So we rebranded to Upbring, and it actually allowed us to talk about our Lutheran roots and heritage a lot more than we used to. So in some ways, it actually became a good thing. So think about, what is your focus mission? What is your reason for existing? And again, the third then would be intentional succession planning. This has different ramifications for different types of organizations. Sometimes congregations, it's a little more difficult, but I think it's just as important. So you have it at the long-term level. Who are we training within our organization to potentially be a leader, either with us or somewhere else? So how do we continue to create enhanced skill sets for people with us? It also has implications in terms of your board. Are you being proactive in terms of recruiting who you need in terms of to make your board a better board strategically? So that's part of the succession planning process. And then there's also obviously emergency succession, where if somebody gets hit by a bus, who's going to take over to ensure that the organization continues? It might be a staff person, it might be a board member, it might be somebody from the outside. What's interesting, and this is fairly new as well, so the Korn Ferries, the Spencer Stewarts of the world, and a number of universities have all done pretty significant research. And the research, in the old days, again, before 2019, we would say, all things considered, we'd like to get somebody externally because we think we just need new blood to come in. And, we're used to seeing this person as a chief operating officer. We don't know if he has or she has the skill sets to be a CEO. What the research is really clear about is that if you have a qualified internal candidate, and this is for congregations as well as nonprofit organizations, and you don't need a strategic pivot. So there's two pieces of it, right? So you don't need a strategic pivot, and you have an internal qualified candidate, there's much less risk to going with the internal candidate than there is to go externally. And it's just something to think about. So oftentimes boards will say we need to have an external search for our next CEO, no matter if we have a great internal candidate or not. I actually just worked with Lutheran Services Florida, who just announced their next CEO when amazing guy for 17 years or so retired. And what the board decided is that because they had such outstanding, they actually had two great internal candidates that, and only one decided to end up interviewing, that we were going to first interview the internal candidates, and then if we didn't think, we weren't confident that they were going to be successful, then we would do an external search. And that's a little bit different than has been in the past, but it's an increasing trend for people to think about. To fulfill your fiduciary responsibilities, you don't have to have an external search. You just have to make sure you have the right reasons and you understand what you're looking for before who you're looking for. All right, so the last three, what are the metrics as a board of directors? And that's one of the reasons we're going to be talking a lot about later today, and you're going to be talking at your tables about, what do you want to accomplish in the next 5 years? And then working our way backwards, what do we need to accomplish in 3 and 1, et cetera? And then what are the metrics to determine whether or not we've been successful at this? And there'll be times, right, we're going to have to zig when we thought we were going to zag because the world is changing so dramatically and so quickly. But it's really important to have those metrics because you tend to accomplish what you measure. We already talked about the second one and the fifth one and the sixth one. Everybody is unique in their own way, and so one size does not fit all. But really understanding what sort of diverse group of relevant skill sets, perspectives, and experience you need. And, an example I like to use is there's an association model of a nonprofit or Lutheran retirement community where every congregation brought in one board member to this nonprofit community. And the problem was that they weren't very intentional about it. So the congregation would have its annual meeting and say, all right, we need one board member for this Lutheran retirement community. Who wants to volunteer, right? And the person that tended to volunteer was the retired individual with maybe good skill sets, but maybe not, but who tended to volunteer at that organization. They just had a passion for it. So they said, yeah, I'll do it. They brought me in to talk about a potential merger opportunity because they were not at sufficient capacity and size to actually be competitive probably in the future. And what we quickly realized is that there was nobody around this table who could actually make this decision because they just didn't have the skill sets. And so what sort of other expertise did we have to come in? And so it's another example of the importance of having sophisticated individuals with passion, with emotional intelligence sitting around your table if you want to have an effective board of directors. All right. Last slide before I'm going to, so if you have any comments or questions after this slide, this will be a great time to have a little bit of a conversation before we move on to next things. So what are the issues that tend to get in the way of an effective board of directors? And I categorize them into plumbing and people. Oftentimes, and I love this about Fort Wayne, I mean, the congregation that's 75 years old is considered the newer congregation around this area, right? I mean, oh, that's the new congregation. Because most of you are like 150, 170. It's crazy, right? Which I love. But what's interesting then is unless you are intentional about updating your bylaws, your policies, there may be some things that made sense in the past that just no longer make sense. And we see that in all sorts of different ways. When I was first on the Lutheran Brotherhood Board of Directors, we actually had a membership convention where members were invited to come and they got to hear all of the potential board candidates give a speech. And whoever they voted was then on the board of directors. So here's the interesting thing, right? It's a financial service organization. We need financial people. We need accountants. We need actuaries, right? They're the worst people at giving speeches. And so people like me who didn't have that background, we won. And so at that particular time, we actually ended up with very temporarily a board with no financial expertise, right? So it's an extreme example of you really have to be intentional and your policies do have matter. So, yeah. So here's one that I like to talk about a lot because I think most boards don't necessarily follow this, and the research is very clear that this is important. So as you think about your board meetings, typically what most boards do is they tend to look backwards. So you'll review your financial statements. You'll talk about your successes of the past. You'll review whatever metrics of the past that you're looking at. And all of that's good, right? But you spend very little time as a group looking forward. And so one of the kind of rules of thumb is that over the course of a year, so let's say you meet 10 times a year, 3 hours a time, so you're at 30 hours. A best practice is actually to spend 15 hours of those 30 looking forward. So some of it's going to be educating the board. So, you know, when in Texas, school choice is coming in a year, we're spending a lot of time educating the Lutheran school boards about school choice because it's important for them to be up to speed on this and help them make good decisions, right? Strategic planning. We talked a little bit yesterday about, you know, when there are, what we'll talk in a second, mini elephants or elephants in the room. It's, you know, assuming there's trust and integrity in that boardroom. The pastor, the CEO will want to come to this board and say, here's something I'm working on, I'm thinking about, I'd really love your input on. Can we talk about this particular issue? And you can only do that if you're intentional about how you structure your board meetings. So recently I was the chair of Thrivent Charitable, which is the charitable arm of Thrivent. And we would meet 4 times a year. We'd all fly in from across the country. We'd be for like 6 hours and then we'd all fly home, right? So what we ended up realizing is we're basically just doing our fiduciary responsibility, but we don't have any opportunity to really look forward. And we didn't really know each other that well either because we're just flying in and out. So the new CEO, Mandy Twong, is amazing, and we made a decision that we're only going to bring in the board twice a year, but we're going to ask them to stay 2.5 days. And those 2.5 days, we're going to be looking forward in a retreat type setting. And the other 2 we're going to do by Zoom, and we're going to fulfill all of our fiduciary responsibilities. So it's just an example of if you're creative, if you're intentional, you can carve out this type of time in order to be looking forward. And I think if you really want to fulfill your responsibility of having that clarity of mission, of really understanding where your organization should be going 5 years from now, it's almost non-negotiable. The other thing organizations don't do a great job of is raising the elephants in the room. You know, so there's a demographic cliff coming. It's already come a little bit, but it's really coming for private universities. How do they handle that? That's the elephant in the room, because even if they keep up with their peers, they're still going to lose about 20% of their enrollment going forward. Sometimes when there's budget cuts or funding cuts, the elephant in this room is how do we make payroll? I was with a board that was having severe financial difficulties, and for the first 4 hours of the meeting, nobody brought it up. And they were just going on like, this is what we do. And finally, I couldn't stand anymore, so I brought it up. But they were afraid to have that conversation. And you have to. And again, that's where relationships and trust. I brought up elephants in the room once and had to make some really bad decisions. And I had a board member, some of you may know him, Bill Tucker from Concordia, San Antonio. And he said, Kurt, you've garnered a lot of chips, but you just used one. And so it's an understanding that, yeah, I have a relationship with you, you trust me, but we had to use a chip this time. And if I didn't have that relationship, I'm not sure I would have had any chips to use, right? There's one board member that said, you know, we don't have any elephants in the room, but we have a lot of mini elephants. And so the question is, what are your mini elephants? And can we have those conversations about them before they become adult elephants? You know, the clarity of the mission, too, when you think about the for-profit world. Last week I was on vacation, and I bet you know where I went. The happiest place on earth, right? Everybody knows it's Disney World or Disneyland, right? JFK's biggest speech. Put a man on the moon in the next decade. So everybody at NASA knew that their role for the next decade was to work towards putting that man on the moon. And to me, that's the clarity that we all need in our various organizations and our congregations if we're to be successful in the long term. All right, we talked about this a little bit. So it's the idea that there are going to be times when board members have to lean in, selecting the next pastor, financial crisis, COVID, a security issue, et cetera. But then there are times, and this is hard for board members sometimes, when everything's kind of running really well, and let the staff do their job, let the teams do their job, and then you get to focus then on the future. And so it's the emotional intelligence aspect of when do you lean in, when do you not lean in, and to understand that there are going to be different seasons of a congregation organization's life. Now we'll look at it from a life cycle of an organization, but this is also a little bit different because this can kind of come and go. All right. So this probably has a different answer for each of your organizations, but I will say this that I think is applicable to almost everyone, if not everyone. And the idea is that in order for the board to feel like they're making a difference and to have true buy-in for your organization or congregation, they have to play a role in creating strategy. And the question becomes how, right? And so part of it is recruiting the right board members so they can actually make a difference. The second is educating them about the uniqueness of your particular external environment so that they understand and can provide input. And then also having real clarity that, we're not making operational decisions here. We're talking about, all right, where do we want to be 5 years from now? And the question becomes, how do we do this? And again, there's not one size fits all, because if you're a small organization, it's going to be a little different than if you're a large organization. Congregations may have a little bit of uniqueness too. What's interesting to me is that for most nonprofits and large organizations, we are reducing the years that we're planning for strategically. So we used to do 5-7-year plans. We're now talking about 3-year plans. I've worked for the last 5 years with Lutheran Church Extension Fund. Our first plan we did was a 5-year plan. This last year we did a 3-year plan, also understanding that we were going to take a hard look at it every year because that world is changing so dramatically. And I think that's true. In congregations, you probably could be looking 5-7 years out because you run a little bit slower in terms of mission and your funding streams are a little bit different. But it's also, I think, impacts you as well. So think about that also. Yeah, I promised that I'd ask if anybody had any comments. I completely forgot. What's on people's mind before we go to kind of looking at your particular organization in your groups? Anybody want to comment on anything I just said? Feel free to disagree, feel free to agree, feel free to add.
Just a question, you mentioned emotional intelligence sometimes. Could you define that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's different ways for people to define it. But for me, it's the ability, this is the non-technical definition. It's the ability to herd cats. It's the ability to have empathy. It's the ability to have true humility and to put others first in a kind of a servant fashion. And understanding that the group is more important than the individual. It's the ability to listen. It's the ability to truly care for the people next to you. All of those are kind of pieces of the puzzle of emotional intelligence. I had a CEO once who announced to me that he was what they call a level 5 leader, which is a true servant leader, right? I thought to myself, I said, if somebody's going to announce you're a level 5 leader, you're probably not, right? And he wasn't. But so that's how I would define it. Yeah. It's funny that another gentleman defined it this way. He said, it's somebody I want to go have a beer with. And there is some truth to that too, or coffee, right? That collectively you can work as a group to take an organization or a project to the next step. Other comments, questions? Anything? Once. Here's one.
One of the things that I've noticed when you talk about lack of willingness to volunteer, it's not so much people aren't willing, they want very specific positions and a time frame.
Yes.
They don't want to be the person who's stuck with it forever. And the downside of that is you get point people, but they tend to operate very independently. And then the lack of communication where all of a sudden you realize somebody else saw that need and was filling it and you have a conflict of time or resources or whatever. And I don't know if that's something other people experience, but that's just what I'm seeing. It's, you know, trying to focus, you talk about your laser focus in your book a lot on what do the people get excited about supporting within, I'm talking about within congregation setting.
Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. In fact, that's one of the conversations that, and I'm not speaking out of turn, at the LWML level, right? So these are primarily 55 to 75, 80-year-old women are sitting around the board table willing to put in 40, 50, 60 hours a week, but also understanding that they're going to have to reinvent this organization. And the Junior League in Austin, the exact same thing, because the younger generation just, one, doesn't necessarily want to commit that much. Like you said, it's more episodic, but also simply don't have the time. And so how do you then maybe have a different staff volunteer ratio so that maybe if you ask somebody to participate on the board level at the LWML, they're working 20 hours a week as opposed to 50 hours a week. And so it's a recognition that our world has changed from that perspective. Especially in younger generations, we're seeing they don't mind being asked to volunteer as long as it's for one day. It's a habitat build, et cetera. But they sure don't want to commit for 3 years. And we get it, right? It's a different generation. Yeah.
You're talking about, you're talking about the gains.
Yeah.
Between looking back and looking forward, on the board, how much of that comes from internally from the CEO really driving that forward thinking versus the board pushing that mission? But I think about the CEOs in it every day, they're really the expert in that organization, whereas board members, we learn a little bit.
Yeah.
We might have our different little pieces, but we don't see the whole picture. So how much of that's driven by CEO versus board?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And it'll be a little bit organization specific, right? So I would consider my past organization a very complex organization. We as a leadership team had to come to the board and say, this is what we're thinking. Here's our goals and our missions for the next 35 years. Please add value to it, right? And please comment. And we do the same thing at Lutheran Hour Ministries. It's 37 different countries, 37 different offices, lots of different multimedia ways to spread the gospel. As qualified as many of our board members are, we don't have the expertise that our staff does. And so we let them take the lead, but we participate and hopefully add value to the conversation and to have things that they haven't thought about. The other side of that coin would be, for example, LWML, where every board member needs to really be focused on what the mission is going forward because they have the most expertise. Sometimes in congregations, you're somewhere in the middle. So a pastor may decide to say, what is it that you want to accomplish in the next 5 years? What is our clarity of mission? Or the pastor might say, this is what I'm thinking. What do you think? Right? So I think it depends on the leadership, but typically you're exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. And that's okay, I think, as a board member. Some boards don't like that, but I think it's the reality. Yeah. Anything else? Yeah, Tom?
Yes, thanks. Millennial here. Coming at
Love you.
being relatively new to being a world,
Yeah.
and we're going through sort of transition with governance stuff.
Yeah.
Can you go the route of designing what is just effective, right? Does that work? Like, I feel like, well, there's so much here that is not serving us in any way to actually achieve what we're trying to do. From my perspective, I'll just cut away anything that's not useful.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's a certain limitation being, well, now there are rules, this is how you have to do this. And I'm curious if I'm going to run into trouble if I try to just sort of take a knife at the things that are in the way.
Do you want to join the LHM Board of Directors? No, you're a poster child for my book. So here's how I would answer this. for most congregations, most organizations, you're going to have operational policies, right? And you need to have them for the organization to run on time. At the board level, I think many boards, especially those who've used the Carver model, has sometimes gone overboard and put way too many policies in that simply aren't necessary. And, and so I would be all in favor of doing exactly what you said, but as long as there's clarity between what's the role of the pastor and what's the role of the council or the board of directors, right? As long as you have that clarity, because I've seen congregations that have 50-page policy manuals, a Carver model. One, nobody reads them, so they don't follow them. And two, in some situations, there's in some ways a toxic relationship, and all the policies in the world aren't going to matter if you don't have a healthy relationship between you and the pastor and the leadership team. So I'd say go at it. I've worked with smaller nonprofits, which is in some ways what a lot of congregations are. And the policy manual that we create is sometimes 10 pages at most. And that's sufficient because you'd rather have clarity as opposed to too many rules regulations that nobody really understands. Yeah, I like where you're heading. Anything else? All right. One more before we turn you loose, maybe?
You mentioned a lot about trust and integrity in the relationship building. How can we in the case and sometimes the online blocks, I guess, continue to build those relationships?
No, another good question. One is I would tell you have to make time. And two, I would also say that best practices is increasingly demonstrating, and the for-profit world's ahead of us than the nonprofit and congregational world, that your ideal board size is actually 6 to 9 people. And so the smaller the board, the more likely you're going to be able to build those relationships. When you have 20 board members, it's tough, right? You just simply don't have the time. One suggestion that Kurt Buchholz is actually doing, which I think has been very useful as a leader of an organization, is that every quarter he engages in a half-hour call with each board member. And there's a couple of reasons for that, right? So one, you're building relationships. But two, sometimes board members don't necessarily want to say what's on their mind at a board meeting in front of other people, but they will tell you one-on-one in a private phone conversation. And so that's another way to build relationships, to hear what's on their minds. And oftentimes then you can get concerns answered prior to the board meeting. So then you can focus on looking ahead, because that thing that was gnawing at them, okay, you've answered, you figured this out, and now we can move forward. So but the other side of the coin is what we tell nonprofit executives is you probably should be spending 20% of your time on board relationships and board meeting stuff. That's a lot, but it's really important and a key component of your job. Now, it may or may not be different for pastors, but it should be a focus no matter what the percentage is. Yeah. Anything else? All right, so here is the first. As you think about your congregation, as you think about your organization, what is it that you simply don't want to give up? And then also, think about it in terms of your story. What is the story of your congregation, what makes your organization unique, right? And so it's worth going back all the way to this. This isn't necessarily your purpose yet or what you're going to do, but what is the purpose? What are your values that you just won't give up? So maybe if you're, for example, a Lutheran school, we're going to be Christ-centered. We're going to preach the gospel, right? That's our value add. That is part of our story. Yeah, we're going to have academic excellence, but we won't give up preaching the gospel as well, just because there may be some outsiders who don't necessarily like what we're doing. So talk about that amongst yourselves a little bit. We'll give you like 10 minutes. We don't need a lot of time on this because there are other things that will probably be more difficult to answer in some ways. But I would love to then hear from a few of you what you think from your particular organization, your non-negotiable values and your story are. So Does that make sense to everybody? All right. And Joe, you can talk amongst yourselves. So, some ways this is the hardest part, but also I think it's the fun part. And I'll explain a little bit what we're doing here. So, the first question is, it's really your elevator speech. What is it that you actually want to accomplish in the next 3 to 5 years? What do you want your congregation, your organization to look like in 3 to 5 years? And I'll give you a couple of examples. So LCEF, when they originally did their strategic planning 5, 6 years ago now, maybe longer, and one of the things that historically LCEF did and did really well is they were what I would call a reactive organization. So when a congregation or a school needed a loan or a church worker, they would go to LCEF, LCEF would take good care of them, and it would work great. But they were never necessarily proactive in terms of being a strategic partner with the school or with the congregation. And they saw from their perspective a key ministry opportunity. This wasn't about growth from their perspective. This was about how do we expand the kingdom to how do we provide expertise in a very complex day and age to congregations and schools to help them grow their ministries that will have a bigger impact going forward. And I know you see this, they were successful at going from reactive to proactive. Many of you have met with people like Tom Campbell and others here in the Fort Wayne area. And that's part of their strategy because I guess it was about 7 years ago, they were really intent on figuring out how to expand the ministry in a denomination that was slowly getting smaller. So that's one example. The other example is my local congregation. We're a mission-based congregation. We're very small. And we have small groups like most congregations do. And what we found, though, is they actually weren't all that effective. One, people were sometimes too busy to go. Two, they were more social than Bible studies, and so we really weren't getting deep in the word. We were connecting with each other relationally, but we weren't necessarily getting deep in the word. So what the congregational leaders got together and had the conversation, all right, what do we want our congregation to look like 3 to 5 years from now? And where we really landed was we want our congregational members to become disciples both within the congregation as well as outside in the community, and we're going to figure out actually ways to measure that, maybe board service, et cetera, the different ways. But how to do that then, we decided we also need to become deep in the Word first. And by what we just, the avenue we went, the path we're going down is we're going to create cohorts of 3 to 6 people. Some of it's going to be in person, some of it's going to be online. So with my schedule, I'm on an online cohort with the 6 gentlemen. And not only are we going to take care of each other, but every morning we're going to have a Bible study on YouVersion or some other version and really get deep in the Word and comment to each other. And the idea is if we can get a sufficient percentage of our congregation doing that, that will naturally translate in people wanting to become disciples. So we first had to start about what is it that our congregation wants to look like? And that was, we want to be disciple makers. We want to actually serve the community and get deep in the Word. And so every organization, every congregation is going to be a little bit different. And then the other question then becomes is, why is this vision so compelling? And, you know, another way to just ask that is, what's your unique role within God's plan? What are we called to do, right? So start talking about this. And what I would like to do is to hear, when you're done, not everybody's, but many people's elevator speech. So, you know, it could be like LWML making it harder to go to hell. There's others as well, right? But What is it that really gives you that clarity? We're going to take Catholic Charities down? I don't know. There's your mission statement. But what is it that makes that vision so compelling? What gets you excited? Why do you want to be part of this congregation, part of this school, part of this organization? So let's work on that for 10 minutes or so. All right, everybody. All right. So for some of your organizations, congregations, this may be an easy question to answer because you've had this conversation in detail before. For others, especially if you have new leaders, new pastors, that may be a more difficult conversation, or for some, maybe you've never had necessarily this specific of conversation. So with those caveats, who would like to share their elevator speech of what they would like their organization or congregation to look like in the next either 3 or 5 years? You pick the date. I've heard one good one somewhere. Pick on him one more time, Chad. It's actually really good. I like this. Here we go, bud. He's not. We'll come back to him.
This came out, for us, it came out of our earlier conversation, but the more connected congregation would be, the tagline. So developing, whether it's a discipleship mindset or process, we have a ton of work to do in fleshing that out, but a more connected congregation.
So at one point, you guys also talked about family. How does that fit in?
Well, I think that, I feel like it's a family to be. I know everybody, but there are a lot of people who, in our earlier conversations, who don't feel that familial relationship. So this would be a move toward, being a more connected family.
Which for a lot, it's beneficial for a lot of reasons, right? But it also includes stickiness in terms of you're more likely to stay in your congregation if you feel like that family connection.
Yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Who else? Tell me your elevator speech. What do you want? What is your congregation? What does your organization look like in 3 years? Nobody wants to talk.
Hey, Chad, coming back.
Yeah, Chad's ready. Let's just see if you remember it.
It's great. I don't know that it's. I
Okay.
think we got a beautiful insight, and just gonna be very vulnerable, say the brand new. We want to be your village.
Yeah, that's good. It's a lot like family, right? Yeah. Henry? No? Oh, Henry's got it.
As long as. No?
All right, never mind.
But we take our cue from love God, love neighbor.
Like. Anybody else?
And the reason I harp on this, the reason I think it's really important is it allows you to imagine the future, right? It helps shape the future of your congregation and your organization. And, if we can figure out ways to implement the family, implement the village, it actually does create deeper meaning for your members, for your students, for your families. And then it's really hard to create organizational plans if you don't know where you're going. And so, one of the important roles of the board and the leadership team is to set that vision. This is where we're going in the next 3 to 5 years. And that then helps drive your operational plans. So the principals, so the other executive directors, administrators, all understand that this is the direction we're heading. And so we are all going to march in that same direction. Because if you don't have this, you're basically going to stall, and you're going to do what you've always done before. And that may work for a few years, but as we'll talk about in a few minutes, the life cycle of any congregation, any organization, unless you adapt, unless you reinvent yourself, ultimately will fail. This is just whether for-profit, nonprofit congregations, organizations, it doesn't matter. And so that's why, and what we've also seen since COVID is people have gotten so, we've gotten out of the habit of looking 3 to 5 years. Part of it is because we're not necessarily sure what's going to happen tomorrow. I was talking to a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and he said, I can do operational plans all day long, but I can't predict what President Trump's going to do to my industry tomorrow. And so it's really hard to plan 3 to 5 years. all of us have a little bit of that in the sense that we're trying to figure out when our congregation, if our congregational members are coming back, what our funding streams are gonna be, what does donations look like in the future. There's a lot of reasons why in some ways we've frozen a little bit. And to me, for me, if you hear anything from me today, it's the encouragement to unfreeze and to really push your congregation and organization to be thinking about the future again, as then you start planning for the future and you start thinking about how do we reinvent ourselves to continue to expand our ministry. Which brings us to the next question for your table. And so assuming that you have a fairly good sense of where you want to go 3 to 5 years from now, and this isn't going to be set in stone. You all may come back after talking about this today, said, no, this wasn't quite right. Have you thought of this? This is, I told you this is speed dating, right? But I think it's really helpful that you have a core group of people here today to start thinking about, all right, if this is our vision in 3 to 5 years, then let's say 3 years, what is it that we need to have accomplished in the next 3 years? And limit it to maybe 2 or 3 things. It doesn't have to be 5. But what are the 3 most important priorities that you need to accomplish that vision? And mostly, probably at the 20,000 foot level, depending on your situation. So I'm not talking real details here. We don't need to get new computers as example. But what are those 3 big initiatives that you want to focus on? So this may be a difficult question. I'll ask it anyway, and let's see if anybody wants to volunteer, because these are probably not necessarily solid plans in place because there are lots of conversations going on. But does anybody want to share where they think their initiatives are going to be going to help meet their vision of the future of their organization in the next few years? Anybody want to share a couple ideas that came up in their conversation? Yeah, please.
A big consideration of focus on, I guess, ongoing digital citizenship. So whether that's for our educators, for our staff, how are we going to use it as a school? But then also, how are we going to teach our students how to effectively use it in an ethical way and in a Christian way where it doesn't create issues with social media, all that, create more mental health issues and more disconnection. So how we can use it to strengthen what we're already doing versus as they press instead of still put the work with them.
And that probably wasn't on your radar screen a few years ago, or at least not as much.
Think about the conversation.
Yeah. So here's an interesting comment that expert give to a group of CEOs of nonprofit organizations. So he was thinking about nonprofit organizations. I think it definitely relates to schools, maybe a little less to congregations. But his comment was that organizations who don't embrace AI in the next 5 years will be gone. And so start embracing AI now in all sorts of levels, right? It could be your business processes, it could be your fundraising processes, it could be making people more efficient and teaching people how to do this. I know in my own world, things that used to take me 5 hours to do, I'm now doing 15 minutes. And so there are benefits as well as obviously some real scary things as well. But it was I would, maybe even congregations as well, but I would consider putting that on my top 3 list of almost every organization. And I would not have said that probably even 2 months ago. Yeah, I should have, but I didn't think about it. Anybody else? Yeah, over here, Joe. Pastor Joe.
One of the things that we have a nice endowment for our church, but what would it look like if we had an endowment for our school? So yes, the choice scholarships are great. I don't think we should, not maximize those to their full potential. But what if we had an endowment? What other things would that allow us to do now? And in the future, if there was some reason that choice scholarships stopped, which I don't think would happen, or if they made us do things that we wouldn't be comfortable with as an organization, what does that look like? So really intentionally thinking about starting an endowment just for the school side of things, even though there were one unified budget, all those things that get that, but really focusing on the school because, 15, 20 years ago, before we had the endowment, the church had to have a bigger skin in the game for the church or for the school side.
Sure.
Choice scholarships that maybe allow the church not to have as much skin in the game as they used to. So now making sure that we help ourselves in some sense in that way too. And the church could go ahead and get to this school endowment, but really set that up for that.
Yeah, I like that idea a lot. I overheard one table, and I won't mention who, but one table was also talking about in the next 3 years, we have to become honest about our financial situation. We tend to put it aside because we're always making payroll, right? But there are some mini elephants in the room that if we don't start addressing, we could get in trouble. And so the next 3 years, we have to have honest conversations and a plan of action for our financial strategy going forward.
I think one of the things too, that if you have somebody that has, your financial side, to look at a lot of the older people in your congregation that are now, you know, we had a great transfer of wealth, and we have a lot of older congregations, but when you talk about your endowments, you know, between the RMDs and just any of the inherited wealth, that also means when you have these multi-generations, that there is opportunity for people to understand and give, but you have to have the right person who can explain that, and it's a value added. You're not selling somebody something. You're not begging for money. You are giving people an opportunity to have a legacy.
Yeah.
So if you have people who are living in the past on how it used to be, it's like, well, do you want legacies for your family at your school? You know, that you can find a way to present the endowment opportunities in a very positive light.
Well, that's a great reminder, example. So Ben gave us some scary demographic cliff numbers. I'm going to give you a scary fundraising cliff that we're starting to talk about a lot. So right now, for example, the baby boomers are starting to die. They have a lot of wealth, but they're also probably your largest givers. It's a very large pool of people, right? But they're starting to pass away. When you look at the next generation, the Generation X, from a demographic perspective, there's a lot less of them. And so the fundraising experts are telling us that there will be about 7 to 8 years of scarcity because the baby boomers will have died in about 10 years or so, of a lot of them. And you're going to have less people able to give that are still living. And so their recommendation is that nonprofit organizations, congregations, schools, at this point need to be all in for estate planning and planned giving, because that's going to be the way that you get through this demographic cliff of Generation X for maybe 7 to 10 years. So obviously you reminded me of the story of Joseph, right? It's the 7 good years, the 7 bad years. Some ways we're in the 7 good years right now. And that, you know, the 7 bad years doesn't necessarily even include a potential recession, which we're in some ways overdue to have. So with that happy note, but yeah, think about ways to ask your parishioners, to ask your donors, please prayerfully considering leaving us in your estate plan. And work with, you know, if you have people on staff, that's great. Work with the LCMS Foundation. If you don't, work with the district, my guess is as well. There's ways to do that. Anybody else? I have 2 more assignments for you before we wrap up. So let's go to the next one. All right, so we've talked about your vision. Hopefully you have some sense of a vision of where you want to be. We've talked about the 3 to 5 things that you need to do to keep this vision going and to accomplish where you want to be. The last question for this particular conversation is, all right, how do we keep this momentum going, right? So we've talked about this. We have a pretty clear vision. We may have more conversations about it. We know what we need to do in 3 years. What is that one thing we need to do in the next 12 months to keep that momentum going, to actually demonstrate to everybody that we're serious about this? And what are the metrics that are you going to use to determine whether or not you've accomplished this? So think about that one thing that, you know, and this is in addition to keeping the trains running on time. This is in addition to everything else you're doing in order to remain a vibrant congregation, a vibrant organization 5 years from now. What's that one thing we need to focus on this year? So some consultants will make you sit through something like this for a day and a half to go through it. So we're doing this in about 2 hours. So thank you very much. You don't at least have to be with me for a day and a half. Before we move on to something in some ways completely different, what is that one thing you have to do next year? How do you name it? Anybody? It's a lot of conversation. I know there's answers.
So this has been an interesting discussion for us because we're on the front end of going through LCEF's ministry clarity process. And so these questions, I think, dovetail exactly with what we're hoping ministry clarity will provide for us. And so part of our discussion on this topic here was we need to be investing everything we have to make ministry clarity be as successful as possible in the next 12 months. And then one of the main goals after that would be to take whatever direction we have from that process and make sure that weekly, monthly, we are investing in making that happen.
Yeah. No, that's one of the benefits of going through a process like that, right? It forces you to think about these types of questions. Yeah, good. Anybody else? Going once, going twice. I have the greatest Vanna White going on here. All right, let's go to something completely different. And so I'm going to throw a little bit of a monkey wrench into this, because I think this is really important to think about as well. So it's in some ways thinking about exactly what we've been talking about in the last hour and a half or so, but looking at through the lens of where your congregation, where your school, where your organization is in the organizational life cycle, right? So here's a picture of that. And so it doesn't matter if you're for-profit, nonprofit congregation, school, at some point you've started, some of you 200 years ago. And there's a lot of excitement. We'll see some slides on this. And, you end up going to the growth stage if you're successful. Then we end up going to the maturity stage. And if we don't reinvent ourselves or get renewal, we end up going to the decline stage. So I'll show you a few slides on this. What's also interesting, and especially in this room, is because so many of your congregations also have schools. As you're thinking about this, as you're talking about this, your school and your congregation may be at different places on the stage. So your school may be in a growth or maturity stage, the congregation may be in a decline stage, and that has implications sometimes from a governance perspective. So I'll give you 2 examples of that since there are so many schools here in this room. So in one situation, in Silicon Valley, there's so few Lutherans out there, right? So the congregation who had a parish school made a decision that they were going to take Lutheran out of the brand, and that they were really going to start relating to young families and individuals, single individuals within their community that don't necessarily happen to be Lutheran. So about a year ago, they rebranded, and they then went from here, and they're in the process of attempting to get to here, right? So they also have a parish school who's doing medium, and it's my guesses would be at the maturity stage. But this fall, unexpectedly, they had a pretty steep decline in enrollment. And so all of a sudden then they're really marching somewhat quickly to this area while this church is at this area. And so one of the conversations that we thought was important to have, or 2 conversations. One is, let's get the church council and the school board together to really name this and name the elephants in the room and where we are differently and where we want to work together, where we don't want to work together, how can the church support, where is the funding going to come from, what do we need to do? And so that was useful communication, because in another example in Texas, the church council and the school board never really talked to each other, and not intentionally, they just didn't. And so the church council then didn't necessarily trust the school board in terms of the decision it was making, so it would oftentimes overrule the school board. So not a great situation, right? So one of the suggestions was that they did is all right, you all have to start meeting together. You have to get to know each other. You have to talk about this as one common mission ministry. And so they did. They started having those conversations. They started to get to know each other better than they had. And so now they're for the most part, on the same page going forward. So another example of that trust, integrity, relationship building is so important, and sometimes unintentionally, because we have different governance silos, that it can be more of a hindrance than a help. So one of the things the Lutheran School is doing is saying, all right, if we don't want to go here and if we want to come here, we've got to do one of three things. We either have to figure out a way to increase enrollment and increase fundraising, or we have to become an association and ask other Christian schools in the area to join us as an association. Or our third option is the strategic option is, do we ask another very successful Christian private school to basically take over our campus? So those are their three strategic options. But it's a great example of you can be in different places, right? And that has implications. Another example that I like to use is Lutheran Bible translators. Now, I have great respect for LBT and what they do, and they've had a long history of translating the Bibles in so many different countries around the world, right? What's interesting from their perspective is a couple of things, but the main one is between them and their partners, by 2033, most of the languages will have Bibles that are translated. And so their core mission in some ways will be accomplished, which is great, right? But then the question that they started wrestling with, and they have 8-9 years to do this because this is still their core mission for another 8-9 years, is all right, what do we do? Do we go out of business? Do we revamp our mission? What do we think about? So we can either close and celebrate, or we can renew and continue to make an impact. And so what their leadership team and the board has made a decision to do, and you'll see it you see it now on social media and on their websites, is that their core mission going forward, and they're beginning this process now, but it'll go a lot more deeper in the 2030s era, is, all right, so we all have the Bibles. Now we've got to figure out, how do we get the communities to actually read and get deep into God's Word? And so it's a perfect extension of what their original mission is, right? They've already, in many ways, gone from, we're going to send American translators over to live in the villages and to learn the language and translate it, to, yeah, we've got some people that oversee this, but it's mostly local people who are now translating the Bible. It's more efficient, it's more effective, you build community. But then how do you take that community and also build it so that once those translations are there, the communities then read and actually live out God's Word? So it's not that much different what they're trying to do than all of us are trying to do in our local congregation. So it's just an example that, because of changes in the external environment, they're there. If they didn't make some changes, they'd be there pretty quick. But their intent, and I think, will be successful in going up to there. So just a little bit more details before we ask you to talk about this for the last thing we'll talk about. So this is a birth event, and there's probably not a lot of brand new, if any, organizations or congregations here in this room, but it's basically everybody's hands-on. If it's a school, your focus is on enrollment. If any organization or congregation, it's on survival, it's on staffing. We've been involved in a couple of church mission plants, and it's one of the hardest things I've ever seen a pastor do. It's amazing. It's just really difficult, right? But it takes high energy, commitment, and sacrifice. And you have typically you have a very clear vision. So then you get to the growth stage. And this is where some organizations begin to fall down. They don't pay attention to formalizing their policies. They don't pay attention to formalizing procedures. They don't have leadership development for their teams and their boards and have clearly defined roles. And oftentimes, too, they lose a little bit of sight of mission alignment. It's not quite as clear as it used to be. And so the focus in this area is, in addition to continuing to grow, is what board processes do you need? What organizational structure do you need? And sometimes it requires even different leadership to do this. We'll see that a lot of times the founder of a high-tech startup is not necessarily going to be the person that's going to lead them through as a publicly traded company. So then you get to the maturity stage. You know, if your school is stable enrollment, you have those established traditions. This is the way we've always done it. The risk in this is you get complacent. You don't want to change. You become inward focused. You don't think about how the external environment is changing and how it's impacting your particular congregation or organization. And you almost have to force yourself to innovate in order to maintain relevance over the long term. And if you don't do that, you're pretty quickly going to go through a decline stage. So some of us talk about this, you know, it's the S curve, other people call it the sigmoid curve, but it basically is, you know, it's like a roller coaster, right? I just came from Disney and I thought about this. So you're going up, 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 and unless you change, you're going to go down pretty quickly. So the trick is to create that new path for your congregation and organization while you're still letting the trains and making the trains run on time. So you're kind of doing both, you are doing both things at the same time. And so, you know, there's lots of different signs if you're in a decline or maintenance node, but you'll probably see enrollment decrease. There's a lack of enthusiasm. Sometimes you've had the same leader for 25, 30 years, and he probably or she probably did a great job in the past, but maybe you need new skill sets in the future. You want that one church service to come back because that's what messed up our congregation when we went to two. And you just kind of lose that connection to community too. You definitely become that inward focus. And you're talking about finances a lot. And so then you have a choice, right? You can either close or you can decide that we're going to take the harder road and to renew. And so oftentimes that includes exactly what we've done today. How do we reassess our mission? How do we want to remain relevant going forward? What does the market want? What does the market need? Where are our funding streams? What sort of leadership do we need to bring on to get us there? And a lot of times it's going to be a bold change that will spark that innovation. So my example from Lutheran Social Services to Upbring, we forced ourselves to do this, and it ended up working, but it wasn't without a lot of pain, right? And it also requires really adaptive leadership by both the board as well as the leaders of the organization, because you're going to make some decisions that people aren't going to like. Selling retirement communities as an example, closing programs. And then oftentimes, and this may or may not be any fault of the organization, but we've seen it historically with hospitals, right? So I work with a lot of foundations who sold their hospital here like Fort Wayne, and to have that sort of endowment to help continue in the community. We're now seeing that in retirement communities where the for-profit world just has so much more capacity from a financial perspective that it's really difficult for other than the largest nonprofits to be able to keep up in this day and age, and also the sophistication and the complexity of those operations are getting harder as well. And so there's lots of conversation going on in that world on mergers. How do we bring mergers together? Do we sell to a for-profit? Can we merge with some of the larger nonprofits? So there's a Lutheran organization in Pennsylvania called Diacon that just merged into, used to be called Lutheran Senior Services in Missouri and now, or St. Louis, and it's not called Evertrue, but they were two of the largest nonprofit systems in the country, and they both decided that they couldn't make it by themselves. And so it's just an indication of what's kind of happening within various different areas. And even in the children's services world, that organizations tend to be smaller, but for the first time, we're actually having some serious conversations about partnerships and mergers, because unlike the for-profit world where kind of money drives mergers, in the nonprofit world, it's typically the board member with the least to lose that is the roadblock, because it's just they feel so connected to it. So it's not necessarily rational. So let's go back to this and have a conversation about where you believe your congregation or your school or your organization is, and what if you have both a school and an organization and a congregation. Are you on the same page, or are there disconnects, and what potential implications are there? All right. We're going to have conversations about this because We have a few more things to do before we wrap up. But I actually do think it's useful to think about it from this perspective. And because it maybe enlightens about where you're at, what you're not doing right, what you need to be doing differently, etc. So, all right, we're going to go through a couple of different things. You know, we've talked about this. The one thing that I have noticed in the past year especially, and even the past few years, is the rate of change in an organization in terms of going through the organizational lifestyle cycle has increased dramatically. And so it's more important than ever to always put strategy front and center, because what worked a year or two ago may not be working today or tomorrow. And so that's one of the reasons why I just really like to emphasize that. You know, the one thing that we're not going to have time to do today, but it's something to think about. So scenario planning is a little bit different than strategic planning. And so what you do is you take various different potential scenarios that could occur, not to plan for, but maybe to predict, right? So as an example, in the LCEF world, our scenario planning would include, what if interest rates go up really quickly? What if interest rates go down really quickly? How do we prepare for that, right? I see some in the Christian school world thinking about digital disruption, and with the idea being that, you know, parents are starting to ask for maybe a hybrid school relationship similar to what maybe they're experiencing at their work. So they'd like to go to school 3 days a week, but they'd also like to be online for a couple days a week. What does that mean for a school going forward, right? Another scenario that I've seen people work on, the school work on, is, you know, especially with the culture wars going on, the fact that we become much more of a secular society. What would happen if we actually doubled down and we became, you know, very unapologetically, openly, you're a Christian school, this is where you would become one of the Christian values. What would that look like? And so doubling down on something like that. So all sorts of different ways to use scenario planning as you think about the future. It may or may not come to fruition. But, you know, as we think about what do we want to spend our time talking 50% ahead of time in our board meetings, sometimes it's education, sometimes it's probably strategic planning and visioning, and maybe sometimes it'll be, you know, a pastor saying to his board, you know, here's something that could potentially happen. This is how AI could potentially impact us. Let's talk about that. So let's have those conversations now before it actually may or may not happen. So this is another idea in terms of how to creatively think about your organization going forward. For schools, this is actually a book I really like, so I wanted to promote it. A lot of you know Dr. Bernard Bull, the president at Concordia, Nebraska. And if you're a Christian school, I think this is an outstanding book on strategic planning. And so if you haven't had a chance to get it, it just came out a few months ago. I think it's really actually useful for schools and their boards to read together. It's one of those types of books where a board and the leadership team could read a chapter, a board meeting, and then have some conversation about it. And I think it does a nice job of allowing you to talk about your own particular situation based on what he's written about. So I always like to promote that when I can. And this, you know, in some ways, some people I think tend to overcomplicate strategic planning and visioning and where we're going as an organization and congregation. It's actually in some ways pretty simple, right? It's why do we exist? Where are we going to be in 3 years? What sets us apart? What's our missional advantage? What keeps us ahead? How are we going to do this? How do we turn strategy into motion? And how are we going to measure? How do we know if we're going to be successful? And I would probably add a sixth to that is, do we have the right governance practices to actually allow us to become a missional advantage, or is our governance system actually getting in the way of us accomplishing our mission? All right, so here are the last two slides, because I've always been told that the key to getting a great review as a speaker is when you end 10 minutes early. So if this is a great, simple way to determine whether or not your current governance model provides you with a missional advantage. And all research informed, research based. Do you have that healthy, trusting relationship that we've talked about? Have you built those relationships? Can you talk about anything? Does the pastor, does the executive director, are they comfortable sharing everything with the board? And is the board comfortable sharing everything with the executive director? So do you also have, and a lot of what we were talking about today, that shared focus of looking strategically in the future? Are you all marching in the same direction? It's amazing to me, even on a leadership team, how many members of a leadership team are marching in different directions, not let alone the board and the pastor maybe. And so how do you get that on board, and how do you focus and talk about that always in the board meeting? And then have your elephants or have your mini elephants in the room been identified and wrestled with in a trust-filled, intentional environment? And then the last four, in this day and age, does your board have the requisite skill sets? Is it appropriately diverse? Are you proactively engaged in succession planning? One of the things that we talk about with nonprofit organizations is when a nonprofit board hires a CEO, they should be having that conversation with the CEO from day one. Because otherwise, if you wait 5 or 6 years, all of a sudden the CEO says, oh, maybe they want to get rid of me, I don't know. But if you have it from day one, it's just all part and parcel of the rhythm of your board meetings. And then also, and you probably only have to do it maybe once a year, but it also then helps encourage the executive director to then create succession planning and leadership training for his or her direct reports as well. So it bleeds down throughout the organization, which is a useful thing. Do you have a clearly defined focus strategy? And then, does the pastor feel supported by the board? Does the board feel supported by the pastor? What's interesting to me is that in many situations, once an executive director or pastor gets hired, in some ways they think that's the end of their job. Yeah, we're going to go to meetings, but we've done our job now. We've got this person. So one of the things that I like to have boards think about is that that's only the beginning of your job. So how do you need to care for your pastor? Now in congregations, a lot of times it's a group of elders, it's the boards, it's other people that do this. But what are the unique needs of that executive director or that pastor that the board can be supportive of? Which, if you have a great one, you want to keep this individual as long as you possibly can. You don't want him or her to burn out in 5 to 7 years. You don't want them to leave for greener pastures. And so, as an example, one nonprofit organization, they hired an outstanding executive director who happened to have young children at home. And they said, yeah, you can work at home 2 days a week. We think that's perfectly acceptable. Another had to take care of a spouse that was an international organization or a family member. And so they allowed that individual to move out of state and to work remotely and to fly in, as opposed to living in the hometown of the headquarters. So there's all sorts of different ways that if you're creative and if you're intentional and if you truly know and respect and love the person that you're working with, that you can support that person. And it leads to missional advantage, and it leads to better outcomes. So those are the 8 in terms of a scorecard. And so let me close this, and we all know this, right? So what I love about speaking to groups like this is I can bring my entire being to the table. We're all faith inspired. We bring our faith to the table. We don't have to, in some way, separate it and worry about how we say things. As someone who's written a business book or two, the honest answer is that the best business advice in the world still comes from the Bible. And I absolutely love this from a board perspective, how we're here today to iron sharpens iron. That's what boards do. That's what executive directors and pastors do. And that's what we can do collectively as a Fort Wayne community as well. So thank you very much for being an outstanding group. Thank you for all of your amazing ministries. It's really done my heart good to be in Fort Wayne. As I like to tell people, that I have renewed hope for the LCMS every time that I meet with a local organization or a congregation, because there's such amazing ministry going on at each and every congregation, each and every organization and school. And, you know, that's where the ministry happens. So when we get a little bit discouraged at times, just remember that you're on the front lines, and this is really cool. The last thing I'll say is that we want to keep in touch, do this here. Every once in a while, there'll be somebody in the audience that has a governance question that they would like to just bounce off. Send me an email. We can find a time to talk. I'm always happy to do that, to be of service to you if that's helpful. If you like reading about leadership, especially in the age of AI, join me on LinkedIn, because I'm going to be starting to be talking about that on LinkedIn as well. Don't join me on Facebook, because unless you want to see what I eat, my wife is a chef, and she likes to post all of our dinners, and then she'll tag me. And so if you really want to know what I have for dinner, you can join us on Facebook. But if you don't, I'd probably stick to LinkedIn. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pastor Tom.
Hey, let's thank